Dogman, squatting in the abandoned building. Dear Scary Stories NYC. Below you will find accounts of both of my Dogman experiences, as mentioned in my original query letter sent to you in October. As per your request, I will begin with the most recent experience, as it takes less time to set up than my original meeting with a member of this most inexplicable of all God's creatures. At least, I assume the Dogman is a creation of the same spirit that created us. I know there are those who think these creatures are the spawn of a quite different kind of deity. So I was in my summer home with my now adult son in July of 2021 when we both had a pretty terrifying Dogman experience. I don't want to say exactly where the cabin is because we plan on spending Christmas there this year, and you said this might air on your channel around that time. We go there for privacy, so I'd rather not be entertaining Dogman fans over the holiday season. What I will say is that it is located in the woods in a part of Pennsylvania, which is between Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. That leaves hundreds of miles of possible locations for your viewers to guess and wonder about. Now, my son, who turned 18 in April, is my pride and joy, and a fine young man. Not only intelligent, but kind and hard-working. He's usually up in the morning an hour or more before I am, so when I awoke early one morning at the cabin to annoying scratching sounds happening outside our front door, I assumed it was him doing something useful as usual. I tried to ignore the sound, but it was keeping me up, and I grew increasingly cranky about it, until the point when I got up, stormed to the front door, and began loudly insisting he cut out the racket. I flung the door open already in mid-rant, and looked out to see, not my beloved offspring at all, but the back and body of a big, gray, furry, man-like creature. Its head and shoulders were up so far in the air that I couldn't see them, but I could smell the animal nature of the body. I knew what this creature was because of my first sighting, way back in the late 20th century, that I'll get to later in this narrative. There was no mistaking that it was a Dogman, a North American upright walking canid, and it seemed to be messing with something on our front porch. I'm not clear what, even now. I heard my son call out to me. He was behind me in the cabin, still in bed. He hadn't woken me up. I had awakened him instead. I looked up at the hairy monster outside the door, and it turned and leaned down far enough that we could look each other in the eyes. I nearly had a crippling attack right in that moment, because this was nearly exactly the same way I had met my first Dogman so many years back in time. I looked deep into those amber-colored eyes in the morning sunlight, and they did not appear wide and cat-like the way you paint them in your channel thumbnails. These were round in shape like our eyes, but surrounded with darkness instead of light-colored flesh. The skin itself was like messed-up-looking black leather, and the creature's breath was as stale as a 3-day-old dog turd. Its fur reminded me of a gorilla's, with its dark grayish skin showing through on the chest, belly, and extremities. The ears up on top of its head were covered in fur as well, and they moved backwards as its eyes betrayed surprise at the sight of me. Whatever he expected to come out of that cabin door, it wasn't me. Maybe he hadn't even seen a human before, I don't know. I think I actually said sorry to the Dogman before closing the front door. I meant sorry for bothering him, sorry for shouting at him when I had thought he was my son. It's about the most ridiculous thing I could have said in that moment. But if you were yelling at someone you thought was a family member, and they turned out to be a really big, really muscular, and really surly-looking kind of dude, you'd probably apologize and back off too. So yeah, I shut the door, but the Dogman didn't seem to have accepted my apology, because he began banging into that door, hard and loud. I don't know if he was pounding with his fists or his shoulder or his head, but it was loud, and it was out of control. My son was out of bed next to me asking me what the hay was going on. His eyes looked as giant as a Keane painting, if you remember those. What I'm saying is he looked as scared as I did, even though he hadn't seen what I had seen. I watched in stunned silence as he walked over to one of the front windows, looked out at that dogman trying to get in, and screamed bloody murder. I don't think he was prepared for seeing one of those beasts. They're not nice things to wake up to. When my son Kevin screamed, the dogman did too. Or he howled, I guess would be a better word. My son was done screaming long before that beast was, but I'm sure the wolfman creature had much larger lungs. We both stood there, watching that door being banged on from the other side, wondering how long it would take the big dumb animal to realize he could just walk through one of the windows to get in at us. Then, Kevin announced that he had an idea, and he ran to his room. Coming back with his laptop and his fancy super loud little speakers, he turned on some of what allegedly passes for music these days, and I guess he expected the dogman to be scared off by that. I tell you what, I would have run away if I could have. But the dogman reacted to the terrible racket as though my son had given him an energy drink. He just got even more frantic about getting through that door. I turned the music off and quietly suggested we sit still and play dead. It took a while, but about 20 minutes later, the creature backed off our front porch and went to lay down over by a tree about 35 feet from our front door. That was the first time I saw its tongue hanging out like a normal dog. In fact, when he laid down on his belly, he almost did look like a regular pooch, or at least a regular wolf. He was way too big, of course, and his front paws had thumbs, but he looked more canine in that pose than in any other. When I saw him that way, I was reminded that he was an animal, and I thought about how I had always bribed my pets when I was growing up. I would give them snacks. Grabbing the roast beef out of our stash, I ran to the front door, opened it as quickly as I could, then hurled the entire amount of it in the direction of that dogman before running back inside and bolting the door all over again. We watched through one of the front windows as the dogman made short work of all that roast beef. My son asked me why I couldn't have thrown the bologna at him instead. He loves roast beef. Anyway, once that dogman finished chowing down on our expensive meat, he trotted right up to our front door and began banging on it all over again. I went to get him more meat, but my son stopped me. There was no amount of meat that would ever be enough for the dogman. We'd be better off thinking of a better tactic than feeding him. My son suddenly had a brilliant idea. What if we put bear spray all around the front door? It might not work, but it couldn't hurt, could it? So the next time the dogman strayed away from the front door to go have a lie down, we both burst out that front door at once. We put bear spray on the door, the front porch, even the bushes out there. That dogman caught sight of us and rose to all fours. It clearly wanted to try to catch us before we got back inside. The beast man came charging at us from only about 35 feet away, but after we slammed the door, we waited. And we never heard the big lumbering beast smash into that door as we had expected. After some time, we noticed it heading off toward the nearby watering hole, no doubt to try to wash the nastiness of the bear spray off itself. When we were sure it was gone, at least for the moment, we grabbed as much of our stuff as we could carry and made a beeline for the car. We were able to make a quick getaway without the dogman having time to react. Like I said, we're going to try to spend Christmas there this year with my son's new serious girlfriend, but we're coming more armed for bear than ever, if you know what I mean, or even if you don't. We both figure it's highly unlikely that we'll ever have another encounter like that again, but you never know, and it's better to be prepared. Now that I've told you about my recent encounter with the dogman, I'd like you to come with me on a trip back in time to the 1990s so I can tell you about my initial encounter with one of these beasts. This one happened, if you can believe it, further to the east of our recent run-in. This was in New Jersey of all places, and this story takes a bit more of a setup than the first one, so please bear with me if you'll excuse the expression. Back in the 1990s, I viewed myself as an activist and a revolutionary. I lived in a formerly abandoned building that I had helped take over and renovate, beginning back in the late 1980s in the final days of the Koch administration. Ed Koch had let the city go to the dogs, and I was one of those dogs. We cleaned the rats out of that building, put in new windows, and repaired all that we could manage to repair. Each of us brought some kind of skill or another with us, whether it be carpentry, electrical expertise, plumbing knowledge, or what have you. What we knew, we taught the others, and what we didn't know, we learned on the job. We ran a wire out across the sidewalk and plugged it into the streetlight in front of the place. Somehow, we were able to light up the interior of the entire building that way. Sometimes the cops would come by and pull the plug out just to get us to come out and talk to them. One time, Con Edison turned our power off, but we figured out how to get it back on before the night came. When you're in your early 20s, this kind of thing can be exciting. I know that every single day felt important back then, and we honestly thought we were living on the edge of changing history. There are entire decades of my life that were not as memorable as each single day was, during that period where we were constantly testing the limits of what might or might not be possible. One of us who claimed to understand law told us that if we fixed the place up and made it livable, and if we were able to maintain control of the building for long enough, that we would become some sort of common law owners of the property. I still don't know if any of that was legit legally because Koch was succeeded by Mayor Dinkins, and Dinkins wasn't having none of that. He's remembered by most New Yorkers for being weak in general, and that reputation was how he was eventually defeated by a certain Republican mayor who shall remain nameless. In reality, Dinkins was really mean. He ruined our plans to become homeowners in what back then was still the greatest city in the country. Before his term was up, he had slammed a wrecking ball into our building while some of us were still inside. Nothing weak about that. It was videotaped with one of those newfangled home video cameras and run on a local public access show, so Dinkins stopped the demolition. The damage had already been done, though, as the one light tap of the wrecking ball had been enough to get the entire building declared condemned, and all of us anarchists were once again without a home. I remember living with some people briefly in Hoboken, in an apartment someone actually paid rent on, and then living in a hovel in Jersey City for a while afterward. I heard someone ranting one night at a meeting that the men who built all these buildings had died years ago. Why should we pay rent to people who didn't even build the buildings? Copyright on books run out after the author dies, so shouldn't apartment buildings also fall into the public domain after X number of years? I know how naive the rhetoric sounds these days, but when I was in my early to mid-20s, this all made sense to me. Eventually, we all scattered. Some went out to Queens to the east, others went to sunny California in the west. I found myself and a buddy learning about an abandoned building that might be ripe for takeover in a town in New Jersey called Millburn. We got hold of a map and walked about 7 or 8 hours to reach the place. When we finally found the address, we found a gutted-out, abandoned 3-story brick apartment building in an urban area just south of a forested area, which included the South Mountain Reservation. Don't bother looking for the building. It got torn down before the turn of the century, not long after my story happened. These days, they have the quaint little South Mountain Ferry Trail there, according to Google Maps. Maybe it was there back then too, but I don't remember anything quaint about Millburn and the day when I visited there. I mean, it was nice to have the woods over there, but nobody on the streets looked very friendly, and we were both intimidated by the locals. Nobody wanted anyone who looked like us anarchists hanging around, and we got all manner of nasty epithets hurled at us. I know when I say a name like the South Mountain Ferry Trail, It sounds like we were in the middle of a picturesque natural wilderness, but the area, at least back in those days, was at least as dangerous to walk around in as Manhattan was. Maybe that's changed, I wouldn't know, since I moved to Pennsylvania by the year 2000, went back on the grid, and never returned to New Jersey except to pass through when visiting New York. Now, that having been said, a look at Google's satellite view shows that just a block away, practically across the street from the building I'm about to describe to you, was and is a fairly large natural area that includes the South Mountain Reservation. In retrospect, I shouldn't have been surprised to find a large animal living in the building we hoped to squat in. That having been said, nobody ever really expects to run into a 9-foot-tall, upright walking wolf-headed humanoid, no matter where they go. So we entered the building from a hole torn out of the back wall. I have no idea what or who made that hole, but we didn't have to bend over to walk through it. Although judging by the remnants of the former tenants' belongings, we could tell that this had been a low-rent building by the end. The relatively high ceilings betrayed the fact that when it was built, it must have been intended for professionals, like dentists or lawyers, to inhabit. This was not a tenement. In fact, it even had an old non-working elevator in it that looked to have been in the building since it was originally built. In the old days, that was a sign of the upper middle class, and I felt hopeful that the construction was going to prove solid enough that our renovation efforts would prove successful. First, though, we had to go room by room and ensure that there weren't any people already squatting inside there. If there were, we'd have to negotiate an agreement with them before proceeding. We never tried to kick anyone out. Our philosophy was to share when possible, and to move on when sharing was impossible. If we bullied people out of their home, then we were no better than the establishment. That was how we felt in those innocent days. And so it was on that fateful evening that my buddy and I walked into an apartment with a westward-facing view on the first floor, and we found ourselves in the presence of a really big dude who at first seemed to be wearing a gray animal pelt over his truly broad shoulders. He was looking at the sunset out of the window, and we were seeing him from behind in the growing darkness. In a quavery voice, I weakly said, "Hello?" and the figure turned its head and upper back very quickly at the sound of my voice. This was not a man. This was something I couldn't comprehend. My friend got it before I did. He said some sort of curse word, then beat it out of there in an almost comical fashion, sliding across the floor and running back outside. I had been trained not to act frightened when I felt threatened, and to be accepting of those who looked different from me. I couldn't understand how this guy's face got like that. Was he injured? Deformed? Was he wearing a mask? His nose looked like a dog's nose. He had a snout like a dog. His head was elongated and canine, not human at all. His ears were on top of his head, not on the sides. His eyes almost seemed to glow in the darkness when no human has eyeshine. He turned around fully to face me, and I could then see that he wasn't wearing a fur coat. He was just plain furry. That was his fur coat. He was a gray furry animal. His hands weren't hands. They were claws. His legs weren't human. They were canine. His teeth were so long they couldn't fit in his mouth. He began making an agitated series of sounds that reminded me of how the local junkyard dog used to sound when I'd walk past the junkyard as a kid. I think that before I put two and two together and realized this was a sort of werewolf-type animal, I understood that it was telling me to back off. That's what I did. I walked slowly backward, and I averted my eyes downward instinctively. I didn't want to challenge it, although that vocabulary wasn't specifically going through my head. Once I got back to the doorway of the apartment, the Dogman charged for me, and I ran out the front of the building onto the street, where some drunk guys on the corner laughed their butts off while pointing to me. I didn't understand what they were saying, but I knew they were making fun of me. I found my buddy coming out from behind the building, and we both went to go sleep in the park for that night before moving on. Looking back on it, that park must have been where the Dogman was from. I think if that had dawned on us, we wouldn't have slept there. We were too in shock to be thinking straight at that point, though. I mean, we were lucky to get out of that building with our lives. Of course, that's something I can say about a number of my adventures back in the Wild West that was the 1990s. Even so, I can't imagine a scarier sight in my entire memory bank of my life from childhood onward than the time that my friend and I locked eyes with the Dogman squatting in the abandoned building. In the old days, people used to celebrate Christmas with scary stories. That's why this year, we're bringing you the 12 Days of Dogman. From Monday, December 13th through Christmas Eve, we'll bring you another full episode of Dogman Encounter stories each day. And then, on Christmas Day, we'll make it a baker's dozen. The 12 Days of Dogman, right here on the Scary Stories NYC channel, bringing you scary tidings and Christmas fear. Nancy Sears. Nancy Sears. She makes me grin from ear to ear. Please join us in thanking today's executive producer, Nancy Sears, for making this episode possible. In exchange, we share with Nancy our secret uncensored stories far too wild to ever tell on this channel. Not to mention our over 21 hours of archived uncensored Dogman stories and a weekly sneak advanced preview. You too can get all these perks simply by becoming a PayPal subscriber at peterbernard.com or by clicking that join link underneath this or any of our videos to become a Scary Stories channel member. Now here is TV spokes doggy Henry Lee Dogman to fill in any deets I may have left out. Hank? Thanks for watching till the end. If you liked what you saw, please consider clicking like on the video or sharing it with your friends and family that you think might also be interested. If you would like to see more of our work, please consider subscribing and hitting that bell icon next to the subscribe button so that YouTube will alert you when we put out a new video. To become a channel member and gain access to our special perks, you can click that join link under each of our videos. Another option is to join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. You can join for as little as 99 cents on YouTube or $1.50 at peterbernard.com, and that gains you access to our weekly secret uncensored episodes. If you'd like to see our 21 hours of archives of uncensored Dogman stories, then please join at the $3 level or above. To get to watch our shows in advance of the public, please join at our $10 level. That gets you all the perks. If you join our channel memberships, you need to check our community page here on YouTube in order to get the links to the secret videos and other perks. If you're in the PayPal subscribers club, Peter will email you all the news and links himself. Once joining the PayPal club, which is Peter's homemade club, please give him a chance to see that you've joined and to compose you a personal welcome email, as none of that is automated. But whichever you join, we'll name you an executive producer for the next available episode. Do you have a scary experience that you'd like to share with us? You can email us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or call our Scary Stories voicemail hotline at 804-LA-SCARY. That's 804-537-2279. It's a Google voicemail box, so that means it keeps cutting off after every 3 minutes. If your story is longer than that, please keep calling back and we can piece it together on our end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more. scary stories.